always nice to share a platform with one of your mentors. Tim and I worked together in 2004, way back 13 years ago. How's Tim? And it's always interesting to be the last one just before tea, and because people are just now going to wait for you to finish so that they can go for tea, especially now that I can feel the smell of some of the cocktails we're going to have and the food we're going to have. So my talk, I'm going to try and be as short, literally as short as possible in trying to deal with this. I've got 37 slides, but trust me, they're all pictures. So I'm going to try and take you through all of those in trying to explain the work that we've been doing at the South African National Biodiversity Institute. So this is an assessment, the first assessment that South Africa has ever undertaken in understanding the status of biological invasions, or the status of how invasive species have been managed, or how they've been invading ecosystems in South Africa. It is also the first ever status report that we have been trying to gather globally. We tried as much as possible to see what other countries have done in trying to understand the status of their invasions, and we couldn't find anything. That's why we wanted to start and say, what is the status of these biological invasions that everybody's talking about? What are the species that are coming into the country? Where are the areas that are invaded? How well are we doing in terms of management and all of that? And I'm going to take you through all of those in trying to understand that. But what's important here is really trying to make you understand the complexity of the whole issue of biological invasions. What are we dealing with here? What are they? What facets of the community or of society are they touching on? But the second part, which is really one of my favorite ones, is really about compiling the status report in terms of the process that we undertook and how well were we able to understand co-generation of knowledge, which all of you probably in terms of research that you're undertaking, in terms of local knowledge that you're undertaking and all of that. And the second issue is really about multi-level governance in terms of all the complexity of governance that we had. And Trevor talked about this earlier on, and I'm glad because this is probably going to, and I'm going to touch on the three of them, including evidence-based decision-making. How are we able to gather evidence from all the research that's being undertaken, pull that through, make an assessment, and then making it digestible for decision makers to make decisions in terms of invasive species. And then I'll just come to number 3 on findings of the report in terms of the different components of that. And I'm hoping that I'll be quick. So species have been moved throughout the world, and if the transport systems have not been that simple, it means that species would not be able to move across seas, across mountains, and across rivers and all of that. But because of the humans facilitating the movement of species, it's really been easy for species to be moved around the world and therefore invading many of the places that you have. And you will see, most of you saw that during lunch, that we had a number of foods that would probably not actually be coming from here. They would have been coming from elsewhere. For example, your tomatoes and your potatoes and all of those would have been imported from Mexico, coming into this country, and then being planted through agriculture, or some of the other species being domesticated and all of that. So the world is now operating at that system where everything is everywhere at any time, especially foods, especially fruits, vegetables, and the food that we eat. We eat bananas almost all throughout the year. But if this movement of species was not facilitated, we would probably have bananas once every year because of the season and all of that. Species as well have been domesticated. Some of the donkeys, cats, and all of that have been domesticated elsewhere, and we have adopted that domestication of species and have moved them across to many parts of the world and all of that. Chickens, all of those have been domesticated elsewhere, and there's that origin of domestication in terms of species that are moved or that have been domesticated elsewhere. So one would ask, so that means everything is invasive, everything is alien then, because everything that we are now accustomed to at least comes from one part of the area or another and has been moved across the world and all of that through their transportation systems. And that complex, that actually makes the whole issue of dealing with biological invasions or managing them even more complex, because now you're dealing with domestic animals and all the stuff that were cultivated and all of that. And scientists have tried to explain this and say, we are beyond that, beyond just the cultivated ones or beyond just domestic animals and all of that, but now dealing with species that would have otherwise been here, not be able to manifest themselves through human interventions and all of that. And then we go through that introduction-invasion continuum. In terms of species being introduced into the new area, how well are they doing? Are they able to multiply by themselves? Are they able to spread by themselves and then be able to perpetuate all the other populations by themselves? And those are the species that we are dealing with. And eventually, we're talking about biological invasions, because it is about tracking the species as they come into the country, and which species, in terms of the status of those species, some become invasive, some just become naturalized, and some actually do not become naturalized. They are waiting for such conditions like climate change, land use, for them to become invasive, or at least to spread along the areas and all of that. And really, this is equivalent to many other problems that we have. For example, diseases, as far as pathogens are concerned, they are able to be managed in a different way, and they're able to follow the same trajectory. For example, the people from the Department of Health, really in terms of how they understand bacterial pathogens or how they understand viruses and all of that, it's really about all the continuum that they go. They jump into a new host, they replicate, they establish, they spread, and the impact. And the management of that is really not different from how you would manage GMOs. It's not different from how you'd manage invasives. It's also not different from how you manage bush encroachment, for example, that Tim talked about earlier. And we heard about all the other international agreements that many countries have signed, and South Africa likewise has signed a whole suite of international agreements in terms of how you manage biodiversity, how you manage ecosystems, how you manage nature, and all of those. And there have been lots and lots of conventions and all of that. Wendy talked about the UNFCCC convention and a whole lot of others. But the one that's really primary here is the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD. South Africa is amongst the only countries that actually manage invasive species or biological invasions through the legal or through the policy mechanisms that they've employed. Many other countries do actually manage invasive species by an inferred policy. They would say an environment policy talks about protection of threats or protection of some of the species that we have, or managing threats and all of that. But in South Africa, right away from the constitution, really from there, it talks about the conservation, it talks about the conservation of natural resources, it talks about humans' well-being to an environment that is not detrimental to their well-being, and also in terms of the NEMA and NEMBA as well, which deals with Biodiversity Act and all of those. And also eventually in 2014 when we had the alien and invasive species regulations. And this policy framework gives roles and responsibility, whether they are clear or not, but it does give roles and responsibilities to either individuals or to individuals, in this case talking about the political heads, or to the different departments that are dealing with those. And SANBI actually has that mandate from the Biodiversity Act, talking about the monitoring of the status of all biological invasions or species, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. So, requirements of the status report is about the South African national listed species, and also in terms of the status report, which will actually help us in terms of information from research and monitoring that we gather, assess the status, and inform policy and management, and then also feedback in terms of what is the research that we need, what knowledge do we want in terms of us being able to understand policy and all of that. And the world, or even South Africa, has got a history of all of these assessments, actually. I mean, we have had the shale gas recently, the shale gas assessment. We have had the elephant assessments. We have had a series of climate change assessments, which I'm sure Wendy and many others have been involved in, and a whole lot of others, land degradation. When I got this slide from Bob, he had said that he's going to put invasives here just to check the mood of the crowd. In terms of where it is, so you will see that this has been structured in such a way that, for example, this is the degree of social contestation. So according to this, it means that invasives are not controversial, and they also involve one discipline. Of course not. Of course not, because invasives actually include a whole suite of human phases. For example, they do affect biodiversity and ecosystem services, they do affect human health, and I'll talk about this. They also affect the economy and a whole lot of other things in terms of the impacts that they have in the world. So we structured the status report in terms of the introduction and a whole lot of other things, including the pathways of introduction, the species, the areas, and also the interventions thereof, and also the knowledge gaps, including the policy relevant messages. And I'll take you through all of those. But my interest here is really about how did we gather this information, and what are the challenges based on those policy relevant messages or the concepts that one would talk about. In terms of how we collated content, or the content that we had would actually require us to spend another 1 hour probably in terms of how we dealt with it. So we appointed the CIB, the Center for Invasion Biology, who are the ones dealing with invasives, and a whole lot of those, and I'll take you through in terms of that. So this is a team's activity. This is the team drafting the status report. Professor Brand van Wilgen at Stellenbosch University was working with us and at CIB to collate and write all of this. And then secondly, we had the workshop or a symposium up in Godini, where we called on all the information in terms of information on pathways, on species, on areas, on interventions, and all of that. And I'll talk about the results of that just now. And then we had to launch this because this is information. The assessment actually needs to filter through until it reaches policymakers or policy discussions in terms of how we manage invasives and all of that. South Africa is probably one of the only countries that is spending so much on managing invasives. And we know the history of that from the Working for Water, because we are tracing invasive species together with job creation and poverty alleviation and all of that. That's why Parliament actually is still endorsing so much money in terms of how you're dealing with biological invasions. And therefore, we have to report to them every quarter in terms of what's going on, in terms of how well we understand invasives and how well we understand the status thereof. And we had to have a reference and advisory committee, which is guiding us in terms of the work that's been done and all of that. So the results of the symposium was that we had a special issue, and this is open. This is open to everybody. It's a special issue of the Journal Bothalia, where we have actually collated all the peer review information that's dealing with the different components of the status report. Not sure if you can see this, but this was one of the interesting exercises that we undertook in terms of the indicators. So these indicators will help us in the next status report that we have to produce in 3 years' time to see how well we have done in terms of pathways of introduction, in terms of species, the status of species, and the areas that are invaded, and also the interventions. And Trevor talked about the outcomes there in terms of how well do you do with the inputs that you have got, for example, the money spent and the outputs of that, and also the conservation outcomes of those, and how well we have been able to manage those and understand those. And you will see just how difficult this has been in terms of collating all that information. Anybody has seen this somewhere? So, as you enter OR Tambo, this is the first thing you'll probably see, because probably this is the urinals, or the bathroom is probably the first thing that you go to after you have traveled so long. So you would see this wanting you to declare any species that you have got into the country. But we know for sure that opportunities for introduction of high-risk species are there, and species are continuously being introduced into the country, and we are only managing at the moment, and when I say we, I'm talking about the Department of Environmental Affairs, is only managing OR Tambo from 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock. So we don't know what happens before 5 o'clock and after 6 o'clock when they are not there, and what happens to other international airports as well, or also in the ports and all of that. The other issue that we wanted to understand is the pathways of introduction and dispersal. So species are moved up from the world into South Africa through the 72 ports of official ports of entry, and then and from there they spread through our network system of either railway or the road infrastructure. And we are aware that a lot of species, once they are introduced into the country, they're able to spread throughout the country as well. And we have seen many studies have actually looked at many of these road verges in terms of some of the species, especially plants, how they are being able to be moved across from Gauteng or from Durban and all of that. And we are able to see that Caitlin Faulkner is our postdoc working at the University of Pretoria and is looking at details in terms of some of these pathways of entry and also how species are able to spread throughout the country and all of that. We know that over 2,000 species are present outside captivity or outside cultivation in the country, and a third of those have become invasive. Most of them are actually plants because of how well we understand plants and all of that. But we have got a series of those, including some of the microbes that you're dealing with, and we're trying to partner with the Department of Health in trying to understand some of those microbes. So a lot of species are actually present. They've been documented, and about half of those, or even less than half of those, 559, have been listed. And I'll talk about the listing of that and all of that. And we have got this list of all this more than 2,000 species, about 2,400 species. We have got them in terms of where we got the data, where do they exist, and this is public information that anybody can actually get. So some of the species, over 100 species have have major negative impacts, and we have tried to collate all of those. For example, some of the wattles in mesic areas, the pines, it's well known in the fynbos, prosopis in the arid areas, and some of the Mediterranean mussels and rocky shores, the cactus species in the arid areas, and some of the fish as well that are invading in the areas. Of course, we had to talk about the impacts, and the impacts in this case would be impacts on ecosystem services, or they could be impacts on rangelands. And one of the other ones we're dealing with is impacts on water resources. This is work that we're doing with David Lemaitre and the team in terms of understanding how invasive species are actually affecting the water resources and all of that. And we have seen that some of the species like your acacias and all of that are actually reducing are causing what we call mean annual runoff. So this is mean annual runoff, the mean annual runoff reduction in terms of which species are affecting that, or which taxa as a whole are actually affecting the runoff, or also which catchments are highly affected. And we've got a list of those. I mean, to mention a few, the Brede Valley catchment, and some of those are actually about 6% in terms of the annual mean, the mean annual runoff reduction in terms of the work that we've been doing. So we also know that biological invasions are the third largest threat to our biodiversity after cultivation and land degradation. We did this work and got the calculations with Bob Scholes at CSIR, now at VETS, in terms of the biodiversity intactness and the role that biological invasions are affecting biodiversity. And we also know that there should be adequate management and control plans and strategies in invaded areas now in dealing with all of those. According to NEMBA and the Act itself and its regulations, management authorities of protected areas and all the organs of state have to produce control and eradication plans. And there have been guidelines that were developed by Ian and the team to guide in terms of those control plans. Based on that, they had to be submitted at least 2 years after the guidelines have been promulgated and all of that. But only 4% of those submitted, and most of them are private landowners, municipalities, protected areas, SANRAL and Transnet. And that covered about 4%, and we have highlighted them in terms of, looking good, David. So we have got a database of all of those that submitted, and we have tried to score them in terms of the adequacy of the control plans and all of that. And some of the interesting results that we found is the species richness per biome, and this is for all taxa. For example, we have the coastal belt and fynbos and the grassland being rich and all of that. And this is work based on some of the complete information that we got. So we have got a database of all the data sets that we have got, where they are from, and also the judgment in terms of their adequacy, in terms of how they address that. We know for sure that we have good information on plants. We also have good information on birds, on birds and plants. So we're trying as much as possible to see in the next report in terms of how that's going to be helpful. Now, some interesting results as well is that the blue is the problem. So these are the individual species that we have, and we got this data from the Environmental Affairs. So the blue is how big the problem is, and the red is how well we have managed it in terms of clearing and all of that. So you can see just how well we are doing in terms of clearing and how big the problem still is and what opportunities it presents in terms of managing invasive species. We have done well in terms of control measures, in terms of the biocontrol. We have had so much in terms of some of the species that are being targeted for biocontrol. We have had a history, and I think this country is actually a world leader in terms of some of the biocontrol agents and biocontrol studies that we are doing, and some of the species are still spreading, even though they've been subjected to some of the control measures and all of that. Only a few under biocontrol are actually surviving and all of that. For example, the middle one is fountain grass, which is even at the moment still spreading along South African roads, despite some of the eradication efforts that have been employed, and also some of the monies that have been spent and all of that. So one would collate all this information and then pull it together and say, we have information for this particular species, and this is how it's going to be listed under the national listed species. For example, if we list it under category 1A, it means that it has to be eradicated and gotten rid of. So whatever information you put here has got to have evidence in terms of what is the risk that this species is bringing, what's the likelihood in terms of projections, and how well can we do that. So listing of this species is really key in terms of the information that we collate. And we definitely, in terms of that information that we would have used, have to be clear in terms of the information that we get. And we did find some of the information gaps. This was one of the most complex assessment that we were doing, but we actually found a depth of studies on impacts, on all aspects, whether it's impacts on the environment, impacts on ecosystem services, or impacts on human health, or impacts on any other social livelihoods that people are looking. When we're saying depth of studies, we're talking about accessible information that you find out there. In terms of pathways, in terms of species as well, we didn't find a lot of information on abundance, only on distribution, and it's only plants and birds, and also some of the areas that are invaded and all of that, and some of the interventions. What's interesting is really about the institutional arrangements in terms of roles and responsibilities. Almost all the institutions are actually working on invasive species, one way or the other, either receiving funding from the Environmental Affairs or at least be getting interested in eradicating invasive species. But we still need to understand who is doing what, where, and why are they doing that, and how do we collate all of that with the capacities that we have in understanding invasive species, and also monitoring of outcomes rather than only of inputs. That's also important. Some of the projects are really working well and they are really doing well, but there are some which are really not producing any desirable outcomes and all of that. So in my concluding slides, I just want to talk about the interesting part, which is really about managing conflicting species as well. As you know, that some of these species, even though they're invasive or they're alien, they're really, really beneficial. For example, jacaranda trees have been there over the years, and they're really beautifying Gauteng, Pretoria, and all of that. Yeah, so I knew I would get that raw from the Cape Townians and the Devonites and all that. Fountain grass, it's there and it's growing inside people's yards and all of that. They love it, and you really can't list that and try and eradicate it. The parakeets and the mallards, you've heard about stories in terms of the eradications of those and how that was highly contested. The bars, the trout industry, which is really huge in economy, also in terms of job creation and employment and all of that. So, and also the most interesting one, which is the forestry and plantations. They've been here over the years and they've been doing well, contributing to the economy and all of that. So how do you list some of these species and make sure that we get rid of them for the benefit of biodiversity while you're still cognizant of the work that they contribute in terms of that work? This is my last slide. So the analysis in terms of those three concepts of co-generation of knowledge, from scientific information, we've been able to get that. From peer-reviewed literature, we have been able to get that information. Other literature, like rare literature that Tim was talking about, or the blue papers or blueprints, blue books and all of that, we haven't really got it right in terms of how we get that information. Local knowledge as well, or indigenous knowledge, if you want to be controversial, it's really we've really failed to get that information. And I think going forward, it will be interesting to get some of that information so that it contributes to that. Multi-level governance has been extremely complex in trying to understand how are the municipalities reporting to the district, to the province, and to national, and all of that. And the complexity there is brought about the ownership of land and all of those in terms of, because the regulations and the act talks about the management authorities and for the area that they manage, and also the private landowners in terms of the area or their plots and all of that. It becomes complex and it becomes a national discussion in terms of how do you get all of that information and also the systems, therefore, in terms of all that multi-level governance. Evidence-based information and as well, we have been able to at least to get content in terms of the evidence that we are doing. But in terms of processes and systems, there's nothing in terms of how we want to be able to collate all that information and be able to at least make it triggered until such time as it becomes available for evidence to be made for managing invasives. Thank you.